Okay, well, we might kick things off. Yeah, really keen to see everyone making a little bit of time to join us for this webinar on the journey to nature positive. Um, we'll be covering a selection of the of some of the regulation changes in the nature management space, natural capital, and ecosystem interface. Um, in our position as multidisciplinary technical kind of consultants in this area. So, um, go to the next slide there, Owen. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. So we're speaking to you from the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and yeah, we hope that we want to acknowledge wherever we're meeting from today, the traditional owners of that particular country. So instead of kicking us off with a trite set of definitions and the nature and ecosystem management, ecosystem services, I wanted to start with a bit of an analogy. This one was originally suggested and proposed by John Holdren and was written up in Gretchen C. Daly's book on ecosystem services. The question posed is, what would you take to set up day-to-day life in the moon? Bit of a silly one, but assuming the moon had miraculously the basic conditions for supporting life, such as the climate and atmosphere, you might start by choosing a range of species that are directly responsible for supplying food, drink, spice, fiber, timber, pharmaceuticals, a whole range of industrial products like oils and rubbers, waxes, and things like that. But in order for those things to provide as they might, you also need all of the things that can support those ecosystems that contain those organisms that provide the goods. So those other supporting kind of unsung heroes include things that manage purification of air and water, detoxification of wastes, generation and renewal of soils, soil fertility, pollination of crops, and natural vegetation. They control pests, they moderate extreme temperatures, and can reduce the impact of wind and waves. So we start to think that we're going to have a pretty big spaceship to manage all of that stuff that's needed to support what we might require for day-to-day life. And through that exercise, you can start to come to understand the conditions and processes that natural ecosystems do to sustain and fulfill human life. And this is rather than starting with, the definitions of biodiversity and nature. I think the thing that we want to keep at the front of mind, because this focuses the aspect on the key areas in which our activities as, in human cultures interact with ecosystems, and we can then be aware of how we can manage them proactively. So just to break down a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today, obviously get into some of the ways in which nature management has changed over time, the last really 25 years specifically, and then dive into a bit of detail about biodiversity and business and economic drivers for really understanding to a deep level this space, and then what we see the next steps being in this management space. So I'll be hosting and doing some of this stuff. My name is Daniel Ashton. I'm a principal hydrogeologist in SLR's groundwater team, but really here in my role as the natural capital and nature sustainability solutions lead for APAC. And I'll be here, with my close collaborator, Owen.
Yeah, so hey everyone, I'm Owen Noble. I'm a senior consultant in the ecology and biodiversity team based in Brisbane. And yeah, my main focus is, natural capital and nature positive for businesses.
So yeah, we're really excited to kind of run through a few of these things with you. We do have a Q&A function in this talk, so if something springs to mind, you'd really like to, get a bit of share it with the group. Really, we'll go through a few of those at the end. There's a Q&A function that you can just type in your questions there, and really interested to see what comes out of that as well. So to start us off, I mean, there's a fair few organisations represented on the call, so we'll just do a very brief overview of who SLR is. So we are a multidisciplinary environmental consulting firm. It's got a global presence with a huge range of staff across an enormous range of technical disciplines. We operate in pretty much all the sectors, with a particular focus in APAC on the mining, minerals, built environment, and power and renewables. So um, if we move on to the next one, it just again dives into a little bit more detail on our APAC presence, where we have offices pretty much across Australia and parts of Asia. The thing I'd probably focus people in on is that over 45 plus technical services, which range from everything that we're going to be talking about here in terms of an ability to have technical specialists that understand a key part of ecosystem services that are provided in really any area. So to start us off with the bulk of it, I suppose I wanted to take a look back in ancient history, 2001. Um, in 2001, the UN Secretary General commissioned one of the largest ever assessments of the health of Earth's ecosystems and its links to humans' well-being. So that was the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And I'm starting here because this is just an unprecedented investigation into how humanity interacts with our Earth's ecosystems and included an enormous amount of technical input. And there were really four key outcomes from that. The first one, humanity has influenced Earth's ecosystems to an enormous extent. I mean, it's not really a groundbreaking statement. I think everyone would kind of acknowledge that, but it really broke down the different ways in which that manifested. Habitat change, which you can see listed in some of these points. The amount of water in reservoirs quadrupled since 1960, which involved interception of double the amount of runoff from during within water catchments. 5 to 10% of Earth's main five biomes was converted, which would mean, habitat loss in those areas, and flows of biologically available nitrogen in terrestrial ecosystems doubled. These are all really kind of like the bones of how we're changing those ecosystems, and that's had a huge impact. And that impact is not necessarily negative. The economic and social change that's happened over that time has been driven by these ecosystem changes. So the world population has doubled from the time between 1960 and 2000. This was in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And they really lay out how that ecosystem change has driven humanity's growth. The food production increased 2.5 times, wood harvest, timber production, hydropower. All of these ways are, again, ways that we can identify how humanity has leveraged environmental, these ecosystems. Now, that's had a negative impact as well. When we break down the different services that ecosystems provide in the way that they do in the ecosystem assessment, you can see that the ability of the ecosystems to provide those provisioning services, which was what you can see in the table to the left, where they are able to supply food, fiber, genetic resources, biochemical medicines, fresh water. These things have been reduced. Their ability to provide has been reduced. The other side of things, the regulating services, so where things are, where aspects of the ecosystem can support the provisioning or support other aspects of human development, those have also been impacted. That ongoing impact, it can't continue because it's, I guess, the definition of an unsustainable use. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment identified three main areas where change is needed. Number one, policy and integration of ecosystem management goals within other sectors and within broader development planning frameworks. That we have seen that happen with the changes of international sustainability reporting regulation and other drivers around target setting in the ecosystem and biodiversity. In the economic realm, they note that the greater use of economic instruments and market-based approaches in the management and ecosystem must be increased. And we're seeing that. We're seeing economic drivers change for ecosystem management, where the establishment of credit schemes in the biodiversity and the carbon. There's grants and tax incentives to support the targets that governments are being made. Uh, and then third, in technology, there really a key aspect was a multidisciplinary understanding of ecosystem services so that organizations from governmental down to businesses are able to understand their interactions, their dependencies, and manage them appropriately. And this is really something that's a passion for us and what we wanted to focus, what we're focusing on here. So that, again, ancient history, but where have 20 years of momentum in this space got us? Well, again, bringing it back to the governmental change and regulation change, and a key outcome of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment or an input from them was the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals have been kind of progressed over time, flowing through into other kind of regulatory environments. These outcomes remain relevant because you can see here in the World Economic Forum risk reports in 2002 through to 2025, the biodiversity loss is listed as one of the key risks to the global economy. So from again addressing this very present risk, the global biodiversity framework was developed and out of COP15, which highlighted protecting 30% of land and oceans by 2030 as an equivalent for nature of the 1.5 climate target. Moving on, we just look at again the timeline of this regulation change. Developing again on the COP15 outcomes was the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, which went into detail on how businesses might be able to respond to these kind of regulatory changes and how reporting might need to change to ensure financial institutions can address these risks in a really robust way. Again, flowing on from that, we have further biodiversity conferences and acceleration of the change. And where the rubber meets the road really is in these things that are building towards the 2030 and 2050 targets. Things like the Australian nature repair market and the transition of these sustainability reporting standards towards more of a mandatory role. So just to dive into a few of the detail there of how some of this international regulatory change has an impact for businesses, I'll throw it to Owen.
Thanks, Dan. So let's talk about the business case. So there are a few key changes to the global and local market. So one of these being Target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which really is a game changer. I mean, Dan mentioned it before, but it calls on governments to mandate nature-related disclosures to reduce negative impacts and promote positive action. So the need for action such as this is clear, given every business depends on nature and impacts it. So whether this is through land use, supply chains, or emissions, nature is embedded into operations. So for land managers, there is a responsibility to manage assets appropriately, particularly for companies that have huge areas of non-productive assets, such as those in mining and those in agribusiness. For financial institutions, however, there's a higher emphasis on the supply chain. So driven by investor sentiment and how nature can be incorporated into sustainability planning and resilience. So while some frameworks are still voluntary, the direction is pretty clear. Mandatory nature reporting is on its way. So this slide illustrates some of this a bit more visually in some of these frameworks that we're talking about. So at the top here, we have the international agreement of the Global Biodiversity Framework and that 30 by 30 target that we've been talking about that has really led to frameworks such as the TNFD and other biodiversity focused protocols. So these frameworks directly influence the corporate reporting standards and the APAC market regulation drivers to govern how businesses report and disclose information on their biodiversity interactions. So why is this happening and why is the nature market evolving? So one of the key reasons is because investors, consumers, and regulators are demanding it. So they want transparency and they want action sooner rather than later. So if you're part of a supply chain, you may need to understand your interaction with biodiversity to report to your vendor. Boards and directors want to see how nature can be integrated into governance, strategy, and risk management. And then sustainability managers want to understand how these shifts may impact reporting, internal education, and future-proofing business practices. So let's have a look at some of these principles in practice. So I guess just an exercise, to start with, how well do you know and understand your nature interface? So some of these questions here. So how do you control dust across your asset? Do you know what aquatic species occur in your riparian systems? How is soil quality impacted by your project activities? And are you aware who may use the water after it leaves your asset? So these are some prompting questions, but the fundamental principle is using developed systems to understand ecosystem services and then quantify these for continuous improvement. So being able to move beyond that compliance to address risk and leverage opportunities that those technological advancements in this space presents. So let's examine some of those kind of a bit more specifically. So on this slide, we've got risks on the left and then opportunities on the right. So on the risk side, we're talking about transition risks like changes to regulations or market shifts to nature positive products and principles. We've got physical risks, which can be natural disasters such as drought, fire, and flood, and then the way that these can damage business practices as well. So on the right, on the opportunity side, there's access to green finance through reduced interest rates and government grants, new revenue streams such as the carbon and biodiversity market, and then enhanced brand value through consumer trust and investor appeal. So here are a couple of real world examples. So on the left, when we look at risks, for example here, a company polluting a water system may face increased costs and reputational damage due to relocation and restoration costs. Just below that, if your company engages with proponents that deforest areas, this can also result in significant reputation and litigation risk, impacting revenue and shifting capital through the value chain to to fix these issues. So on the flip side, on the right here, when we're looking at opportunities, restoring a degraded mangrove system can increase resilience of infrastructure and provide options with carbon sequestration. So these nature interface assessments help businesses make these informed strategic decisions to figure out what they sort of need to do to advance their nature interactions. So as we think back on the outcomes of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that Dan mentioned before, one of those key next steps was creating market incentives. So these have resulted in various economic incentives that are sort of there to create value for biodiversity and businesses. So for example, up the top here, we have biodiversity credits, carbon credits, and a materiality understanding all being value generation starting points. These can lead to tax incentives, environmental benefits, and government grants that can result in direct value, increasing company revenue and land value. So a quick example of one of these opportunities is the New South Wales Carbon Landscape Grant of up to $500,000 for land managers looking to improve their environmental management within New South Wales. So when we have a look at the right here, we have how investment in biodiversity opportunities and future planning can lead to indirect value, such as increases to company marketability and reputation. So these financial incentives are real and they're really more accessible than they've ever been before. So we conducted a value generation assessment for a forestry and cropping production company within the Northern Territory. So this client was looking to understand their nature-related impacts and dependencies and the entry options into the carbon and biodiversity market. So as part of this assessment, our ecologists were on site to determine the ecological values present and provide specific management options for them moving forward. The project highlighted significant nature-related dependencies, particularly related to water availability within the Northern Territory. This assessment revealed a few entry points into carbon and biodiversity markets and a forward work plan to assist the client in prioritization and investment allocation moving forward. So I'll hand back over to Dan to talk through taking some of these next steps.
Thanks very much, Owen. So, taking the next steps in this space will greatly depend on your level of maturity. Some organizations will have already started their work to understanding their, risks and impacts and dependencies and some of these kind of areas of risk. Um, it can happen at any sort of level, though. Whether you've just starting to get into, understanding these risks and your nature interaction. So perhaps that's starting with the direct operations or your direct area of influence, and the output from that being some regulatory responses and risk registers that allow you to act more strategically in the space, or all the way through to organizations that have, regularly carried out ecological evaluations. And in that situation, it might just be tailoring or expanding to areas of your supply chain so that you can present a full cumulative assessment of your nature impacts and try and really use that to leverage these opportunities. In terms of the detail, um, the Well, so wherever you are, kind of in that spectrum of maturity in the space, there's some steps that you can take. We've outlined a few here as more or less based off the approaches that are consistent with the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures, but breaking it down into really kind of like actionable areas, exploring, educating, I mean, understanding all of these different aspects, and then developing, the understanding of the technical data, and then exploring kind of what that means for your business, assessing those impacts and dependencies, pulling them through to a roadmap of risks and opportunities and how you might change your strategy there, and then really following that through to delivering on projects that are able to increase its value and mitigate risk, and then using that as an opportunity to lead in the space. Now that's a bit of a run through, I guess, of our approach and some of the lessons that we've learnt from our work in this space more recently. But this is not really the end of it. It's really just an introductory presentation about kind of how we've got here and kind of where we see it at the moment. We've got a number of other presentations planned. The next one being an investigation, a deep bit of a deep dive into the nature reporting and how some of the changes to nature reporting in Europe might be felt in other parts of the globe, and also examining how the nature-related financial disclosures is built off the climate reporting, and what lessons perhaps we can take from that. We have a team of climate and carbon sustainable advisory specialists that are really nailing that stuff, and we're really keen to get their thoughts on this area. Following on from that, we've got a presentation planned to dive in again a little bit more on the practical side of things on nature-related risks and opportunities, specifically investigating nature-positive, nature-based solutions, sorry, where we see this kind of win-wins of an intelligent approach to ecosystem management, solving a problem, and also having benefits that come from understanding these services at a bit of a higher level of value. So we hope that you'll join us for those, and really interested if any of this has kind of spoken to you and you're keen to have a chat about something specific about your operations or unpack something in a bit more detail, to get in touch. I'll just now have a quick look and maybe give people a second if they wanted to submit any questions for the group. All right, looks like fairly well, you've addressed all the questions, Owen.
Hmm, don't be shy. It's always that awkward minute or two.
Yeah. So we've got a question here from Mito. Um, what are the upcoming climate risk events that you've been seeing clients struggle with the most? Well, that'd be probably a question that's best for some of our team. Director James Balak-Meacher, he was going to try and make the call, and something that he could probably explain in a lot more detail than I could. I'd encourage you, though, if you were interested in that our next talk would really examine that in a bit of detail. Um, but yeah, that's something that we're kind of looking at the nature-based side of things.
I think on that as well, like a lot of sustainability managers are, first thing they're worried about at the moment is those ASRS disclosures and what they're needing to do. And sort of the thought of, nature disclosures on the top of that is pretty concerning. So I think it's a lot of sustainability managers are trying to see how they can incorporate the two, and sort of embed that into some of the upcoming reporting to, save some of the heartache of having to rush through and get a ASRS report done by a financial end of financial year.
Got another question coming in from Georgie. What are the key incentives in Australia at the moment for companies to explore these natural capital opportunities? Owen, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I guess one of the key things is the government is trying to provide a lot of incentives. So there's a huge amount of grant money, tax incentives, but also partnerships available from different governments depending on where your business is located. That New South Wales grant that we mentioned, is just one example of that. That's kind of one of the key government, I guess, incentives. Um, Another incentive is a lot of sort of corporate head offices overseas, may have set targets, or you may be part of a global supply chain. So, for example, if you're exporting into Europe, there's deforestation rules, and depending on what products you export into Europe, you may need to report on what your nature interface is in Australia, and that's sort of proactively happening for a few different clients in different industries. Did you have anything to add, Dan?
No, that's it. I think those mechanisms like the nature repair market and changes to the way that offsets are being managed are definitely two huge incentives. And I think that yeah, does the flow through from the kind of global the flow down of those global changes is definitely going to be felt in Australia. Yeah.
Looks
We have
like
another.
we've got.
Oh, sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, no, I was just going to say we've got another question here, from Emma. How close to achieving the 30 by 30 target do you believe we are? And what is one thing you believe needs to occur to enable this target to be achieved? That's a great question. I think the last time I looked, we were at hovering at about 23%, towards that target, and I think that was last year. So hopefully we've made a bit of momentum since then. I think, one of those key things is the government making the action, converting some of the conservation estates that they have, um, that are not kind of actively managed, to being actively managed for that 30 by 30 target. But I think there's a huge opportunity here for businesses as well that have a huge number of land assets. Some of these non-productive areas, you know, be these like mining areas where they're not being used, or different agri businesses where you may have, forestry in one area and then non-productive areas that are not really useful for any forestry practices. And there's a huge opportunity there to, partnership with the government, to contribute to that 30 by 30 target.
Well, we've got nothing more. Thank you so much for sharing those questions. And as I mentioned, always really keen to unpack things in a bit more detail about project-specific ideas or examples of where we might be able to understand our ecosystem services and leverage that to manage things a bit more proactively. Um, yeah, appreciate all your time and have a great rest of your week.
See you, everyone.